Being dragged by the wrist across a service floor still slick with spilled bisque, Giulia Moretti twisted hard enough to feel her shoulder scream, and she still didn't stop shouting. "Let go of me," I said, "let go. You don't get to argue your way out of this one." Chef Renzo's fingers dug deeper into her arm, hauling her past the past the line cooks who'd all gone very still, very interested in their cutting boards. "You embarrassed this kitchen in front of a client worth $400,000 a year. I saved that dinner. You'd have sent out raw duck." "Get her bag." Renzo snapped at the sous chef, not even looking at her now, like she'd already stopped being a person and started being a problem to be removed. Somewhere behind the swinging doors, laughter. Somewhere behind that, the low murmur of the private dining room, where 12 men in dark suits sat around a table she'd spent 6 hours setting. If this story hits you in the chest the way it's about to, hit subscribe now, because what happens at that table is going to change everything, and you don't want to miss where this goes. Giulia planted her heel against the doorframe and stopped moving, all 190 pounds of her suddenly immovable. "You don't get to throw me out the service exit like garbage. I made that food. You made a scene. I made the only thing on that pass that wasn't sending people to the hospital." Renzo's face went red in that particular way it always did right before he said something he'd pretend later he hadn't meant. "Nobody wants to look at you plating their dinner, Giulia. You think I don't hear the comments? You think the owner doesn't ask me why the girl who looks like that is anywhere near the front of house on a night like tonight?" The words landed exactly where he wanted them to. She felt them land. And then, underneath the sting, something colder and steadier rose up to meet it. The same thing that had gotten her through culinary school on scholarships nobody expected her to win, through 11 years of kitchens that wanted her talent, and not her body standing anywhere a client could see it. "Then fire me," she said. "Don't drag me." He let go, so suddenly she stumbled into the doorframe. "Fine, you're done. Get your knives and get out before I call someone to walk you out." That was when the private dining room door opened. Not swung. Opened deliberately by a hand that filled the frame, and the noise of 12 men talking business died into nothing in under 2 seconds. Giulia knew before she turned around that whoever had just walked out didn't belong to a world where people got dragged across floors and nobody did anything about it. Whose hands were on her? The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Renzo turned, and Giulia watched something happen to his face that she'd never seen happen to Renzo's face in 3 years of working under him. Real, immediate fear. "Mr. Marchetti, there's no issue here. This is a staffing matter." I asked whose hands. Dominic Marchetti stepped fully into the hallway light, and it caught the ink climbing out of his collar, up the side of his throat, dark lines disappearing under his jaw, the kind of tattoos that didn't stop at the wrist, that told you a man had been marked a long time before he'd ever put on a suit this expensive. His eyes weren't on Renzo anymore. They were on Giulia's arm, on the red finger-shaped marks already rising on her skin. "She's a line cook, sir. She overstepped. She's the reason I finished that duck instead of sending it back to whatever amateur plated the first attempt." Dominic hadn't raised his voice once, and somehow that made it worse, made every man still seated at that table lean subtly toward the door to hear better. "I asked the owner to bring out whoever fixed my dinner. I did not ask for an apology. I asked for a name." Nobody answered him. He looked at Giulia directly for the first time, and something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but sharpened into focus, the way a man looks at something he wasn't expecting to find in a service hallway, and now can't stop looking at. "What's your name?" Her mouth had gone dry. "Giulia. Giulia." He said it like he was testing the weight of it. Then, without turning his head, without raising his voice, "Renzo, you're going to apologize to her. And then you're going to explain to me why the best plate that's come out of this kitchen in 2 years was almost thrown out with the trash." Renzo opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Dominic held out his hand toward Giulia. Not a handshake. Not quite. More like an invitation into a version of the night she hadn't seen coming. "Come inside. Sit down. I have questions about that sauce, and I don't like being interrupted when I'm asking them." Behind him, through the open door, 11 men who ran half the ports on the eastern seaboard were all staring at her now, waiting to see what she'd do. Giulia didn't move right away. Every instinct built over 11 years of kitchens told her this was the part where she said, "Thank you, I'm fine, I'll just go," shrank herself back down to a size the room could digest. Renzo was still standing there rubbing his palm, like he could rub the last 30 seconds off it. "I'm covered in service," she said instead. "I smell like fryer oil." "Good," Dominic said. "Means you were working, not standing around." That got a low laugh from someone still seated at the table, quickly swallowed when Dominic's gaze cut sideways toward the sound. He didn't wait for her to decide. He simply stepped back, held the door, and the 12 men inside watched her walk past the head of the table into a room that smelled like Barolo and cedar and money. "Sit," Dominic said, and pulled out the chair beside his own. Not across from him, not down at the far end where an employee might be tucked out of sight. Beside him, she sat. Her apron was still on. She hadn't thought to take it off, and now it felt like the loudest thing in the room, flour dust and duck fat stains, and her name embroidered crooked on the chest because she'd sewn it on herself at midnight 2 years ago. "The sauce," Dominic said, like they were mid-conversation already. "Tell me what's in it." "Reduced marsala, veal stock, a little espresso for depth, and I finished it with orange zest because your duck was going to be too rich without something to cut it." "Nobody told you to change the recipe." "Nobody told me not to." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one, like he'd forgotten the muscles that made it. "Renzo," he said, not looking away from Giulia, "what's her position here?" Renzo, still hovering in the doorway like he wasn't sure if he'd been invited to stay or already fired himself. "Line cook. Third station." "Third station." Dominic repeated it flatly, like the words themselves were an insult he was trying on for size. "You had a chef capable of that plate working third station, and your first thought tonight was to have her dragged out the service exit." "Sir," there were complaints. "About?" Renzo stopped himself. "About what?" The silence stretched long enough that Giulia felt it in her chest, felt the old familiar heat crawl up her neck, the specific humiliation of being discussed in the third person like she wasn't sitting right there in her too small chair with her too visible body. She'd lived this scene before, just never with an audience like this one. "Say it," she said quietly, surprising herself. "Go on. Say what the complaints were about." Renzo's jaw worked. "About her being front of house on nights with important clients." Dominic set down his wine glass with a precision that was somehow more threatening than if he'd slammed it. "I run a company with 400 employees, Renzo, and not one of them keeps a job because of how they look standing next to me. I keep people because of what they're capable of. This woman is capable of a dish that made me put my fork down twice tonight to actually think about what I was eating. That does not happen. Not at De Silvano. Not at the places I flew a chef in from Palermo for my mother's 80th. Twice." One of the men at the far end of the table, older, gray at the temples, a scar cutting through one eyebrow, leaned toward the man beside him and murmured something. Dominic's eyes flicked there instantly, and whatever had been about to be said died in the man's throat. "You have something to add, Salvatore?" "No, don't." "Good." Back to Giulia, and the shift in his voice when he spoke to her was so total it was almost disorienting, like two different men occupied the same body. "How long have you been cooking?" "Since I was 9. My nana's kitchen in Bensonhurst. Professionally, 11 years. And in 11 years, nobody's made you head chef of anything." It wasn't a question so much as a diagnosis, and it landed somewhere under her ribs she hadn't expected to still be tender after all this time. "No," she said. "Not yet." "Interesting." Dominic sat back, and for a moment he looked at her the way she imagined. He looked at a ledger that didn't balance, like an error somebody was going to have to answer for. "I'm hosting a dinner Friday. 18 people, all of them men who think they know good food because they paid a lot of money for bad food their whole lives. I want you to cook it." The table went very quiet. "I have a job," Giulia said, glancing at Renzo, who looked like he might be sick. "You had a job. As of 90 seconds ago, you were unemployed, based on what I walked out into." Dominic reached inside his jacket, and the movement pulled his sleeve back just enough to show more ink underneath, black lines disappearing past his wrist like they had no intention of stopping anywhere convenient. He set a card on the table between them, nothing on it but a phone number in embossed black. Friday. My house. Full creative control. You name your price. And if I say no, something like genuine amusement crossed his face for the first time all night. Nobody said no to me in a long time, Giulia. I'd actually be curious to see it. He stood, buttoning his jacket, the conversation apparently over on his terms the way everything in that room seemed to happen on his terms. But I don't think you're going to say no. I think you're tired of kitchens that put you at the back station and call it protecting the brand. He was already halfway to the door when Salvatore, the gray-templed man with the scarred brow, spoke again, low enough that he probably thought Giulia wouldn't hear it. Dumb. You know who her father used to run with, back in the day? Dominic stopped walking. Dominic turned back slowly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop with him. What did you say? Salvatore's confidence, so sure of itself a second ago, visibly buckled under the weight of that stare. I recognize the last name. Moretti. There was a Frank Moretti ran the docks out of Red Hook 25 years back. Before he what? Giulia said, and her voice cut through the room sharper than she meant it to, sharper than she'd let it get in years. Every man at that table turned to look at her instead, and for once she didn't feel the urge to shrink. Salvatore glanced at Dominic like he was asking permission to keep talking. Dominic said nothing, which apparently was permission enough. Before he disappeared, Salvatore said, "Nobody ever found out what happened to Frank Moretti. Different stories. Some people say he crossed the wrong family. Some people say he just ran." "He didn't run," Giulia said quietly. "He died in a warehouse fire when I was 7. I have the death certificate. I have his badge from the Longshoremen's Union in a box under my bed. Whatever story you heard, it's not the one that actually happened to my family." Nobody at the table said anything to that. Dominic watched her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not pity, which she would have hated, but something closer to recalculation, like a man redrawing a map he'd thought was finished. "You knew him," she said, looking at Salvatore now. "You said his name like you knew him." "I was young. Ran errands for men who ran errands for him. He was..." Salvatore glanced at Dominic again, then seemed to decide the risk was worth it. "He was respected. Before everything." "Before what everything?" Dominic's hand came down on the back of Salvatore's chair, not touching him, just resting there, and the older man went quiet instantly, the conversation closed by a gesture that hadn't even required words. "Enough," Dominic said. "This isn't the place." He turned back to Giulia, and whatever had briefly cracked open in his expression sealed itself again, controlled, deliberate. "Friday. My house. We'll talk about Frank Moretti another time, if you want to. Tonight, I just want the 18 men I'm feeding to eat something that makes them nervous about how good it is." He left. The table emptied out behind him in 2s and 3s, murmuring, glancing back at her like she'd become something more interesting than the dinner they'd just eaten. Renzo lingered by the door, and when it was just the two of them left in a room full of half-drunk wine glasses, he finally found something to say. "You should have told me your last name was Moretti." "Why? So you could have dragged me out faster?" He didn't answer that. He didn't have an answer for that. Giulia picked up the embossed card off the table, turned it over once like it might explain itself, and put it in her apron pocket. If you've ever had a moment where someone finally saw what you'd been worth the whole time, drop in the comments, because Giulia is about to walk into a world that's going to test whether Dominic Marchetti's word actually means what he thinks it means. She walked out through the kitchen instead of the service exit this time, past line cooks who watch her go with expressions somewhere between shock and reassessment, past the walk-in where she'd cried after her last performance review, past the pass where Renzo's name was still taped above the ticket rail, even though hers never had been. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She didn't need to. The night air outside hit her different than it usually did, colder, clearer, like something had shifted loose in her chest and let more of it in. She pulled out her phone and looked at the card again under the streetlight. No name on it, no company, just a number like whoever had it printed assumed everyone already knew who it belonged to. Her own phone buzzed before she'd even decided whether to call. A text from a number she didn't recognize. "Friday, 7 p.m. Send your knife list, and I'll have everything sourced by Thursday. Anything you can't get in this city, I'll have flown in. DM." She stared at it standing on the sidewalk outside a restaurant that had just fired her, or almost fired her, or unfired her. She genuinely wasn't sure anymore which of those things had actually happened. A car pulled up at the curb. Not one of the black SUVs the men inside had left in. Something quieter, a sedan she hadn't noticed before, and the back window rolled down. It wasn't Dominic. It was a woman, maybe 50, hair pulled back severe and elegant, watching Giulia with an expression that wasn't unkind exactly, but wasn't warm either. "You're the cook," the woman said. "Not a question. I am." He hasn't asked a woman to cook for him personally in 4 years. Not since. The woman stopped herself the way everyone in this night seemed to keep stopping themselves, swallowing the ends of sentences like they were dangerous to finish. "You should know what you're walking into before Friday. It isn't just dinner. Who are you?" The window began rolling back up before the woman answered, her voice already half swallowed by the glass. "Ask him about his sister. Ask him what happened the last time he let someone new sit that close to the table." The car pulled away, and Giulia stood alone on the sidewalk holding a phone with a stranger's message glowing on the screen, an apron still tied around her waist, and the sudden, dislodging sense that whatever Friday actually was, it had very little to do with dinner at all. Thursday morning arrived, with a black SUV parked outside Giulia's building before she'd even finished her coffee. A driver in a dark suit standing beside it like he'd been carved out of the same stone as the car. "Mr. Marchetti sent me for your ingredient list," he said, "and to take you to source anything you can't find yourself. I haven't even decided the menu yet. He said you'd say that. He said take your time." She spent the day moving through the city like she was seeing it from inside someone else's life. A fish market in Chinatown where the driver, whose name turned out to be Tomas, made 3 phone calls and got her first pick of a delivery that hadn't even hit the display case yet. A specialty shop in the West Village where a block of aged Parmesan appeared from the back room the moment Tomas said Dominic's name. Nobody asked her to justify a single choice. Nobody suggested she scale back the portions or simplify the presentation for a crowd that wouldn't appreciate it. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like standing on a floor she hadn't tested yet. "How long have you worked for him?" she asked in the back seat, watching Manhattan slide past. 6 years. He seems, she searched for the word, careful about who gets close. Tomas met her eyes in the rearview mirror, and something passed over his face, quick and gone. He wasn't always. "What happened?" "Not my place, Ms. Moretti." By Friday evening, Dominic's house turned out to be less a house than a fortress dressed up in warm lighting. Stone walls, iron gates, a kitchen the size of the entire restaurant she'd just been dragged out of, outfitted with equipment, so new some of it still had protective film on the handles. Dominic met her at the service entrance himself, sleeves rolled to the elbow, ink visible all the way up past where his collar opened, and for a second neither of them said anything. "You came. You paid for a car and a fish market spending spree." Felt rude not to. That almost smile again, more solid this time, like the muscles were remembering how. "Kitchen's yours. Anyone gets in your way tonight, you tell me, and they won't get in your way twice." She worked for 3 hours with a focus she hadn't felt in years, no one looking over her shoulder to ask why she was taking up so much space at the stove, no one measuring the width of her hips against the width of the walkway. When the first course went out, a saffron risotto with seared scallops, plated the way she'd wanted to plate things for a decade and never been allowed to, she heard it before she saw it. The dining room going quiet the particular way a room goes quiet when food actually earns the silence. Dominic came back to the kitchen himself between courses instead of sending someone. "They're asking who you are. What did you tell them?" "That you're the only person in this city who's made me finish a plate without checking my phone once." He leaned against the counter, close enough that she caught cedar and something warmer underneath it, and watched her plate the second course with an attention that had nothing to do with the food. "Frank Moretti's daughter. I looked into it after last night." Her hands didn't stop moving, but something in her chest did. "And he wasn't just Longshoremen's Union, Giulia. He ran cargo for people who mattered back before my father's time even. The fire that killed him. There are 3 different stories about how it started, and none of them are the official one. Say what you're actually trying to say." "I'm saying your father knew things. Powerful things. And there are people still alive who'd rather those things stayed buried with him. He watched her reaction carefully, like he was testing the ground before he put his full weight on it. I'm saying you walking into rooms like this one might mean more than either of us thought it did last night. Before she could answer, the kitchen door swung open hard enough to bang against the wall, and a woman walked in wearing a dress that cost more than Julia's monthly rent. Dark hair, sleek and perfect, the kind of thin that made every doorway look easy. Dominic, there you are. Her eyes moved to Giulia, took a full, unhurried inventory, and something cold slid behind them. So this is her, the girl everyone's whispering about. Vittoria. Dominic's voice went flat in a way Giulia hadn't heard yet, careful in a different register than careful with Salvatore. You weren't on the guest list tonight. I don't need to be on a list for a house I helped decorate. Vittoria's gaze slid back to Giulia, slow, deliberate, cataloging. You know he doesn't do this. Personal chefs. Private dinners. Not since, she stopped, the same aborted sentence Tomas had left hanging. The same one the woman in the car had left hanging, like the whole city was circling something none of them would name out loud. Since what? Giulia said, done being talked around. Vittoria smiled, and it didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. Ask him about his sister sometime. Ask him what it cost the last time he let a woman he barely knew get this close. She turned back to Dominic, voice dropping into something more intimate, more possessive, the tone of a woman reminding a room who she believed she still belonged to. We need to talk. Alone. Tonight. Dominic didn't move from where he stood, didn't put an inch of space between himself and the counter Giulia was working at. There's nothing to talk about, Vittoria. There's an engagement announcement my father is expecting to make in 3 weeks that says otherwise. The kitchen went silent, except for the low simmer of sauce Giulia had forgotten she was still stirring, her hand moving on instinct while everything else in her went very, very still. The wooden spoon stopped moving in Giulia's hand. Engagement, she repeated, and the word came out steadier than she felt. A formality, Dominic said, not to Vittoria, to Giulia, like he needed her to understand that first before anything else got said in that kitchen. Our fathers arranged it 8 years ago. I never asked for it. I've never signed anything. I've never given her a ring. You've never unarranged it either, Vittoria said, and there was real venom under the silk now, the mask slipping enough to show what was underneath it. Because you know what happens to this family if the Calabrese money walks away from the table. You know what happens to the shipping contracts. This isn't about romance, Dominic, it never was, and you don't get to forget that because some line cook plated your scallops prettier than the last one. Get out of my kitchen, Dominic said, and his voice had dropped to something Giulia hadn't heard from him yet. Not loud, but final, the tone of a man who didn't repeat himself. Vittoria didn't move right away. She looked at Giulia one more time, up and down, slow and cruel in a way that was almost surgical, designed to find every soft place and press on it. You should enjoy tonight, she said. It won't last. It never does with him. He collects people who interest him for a while, and then he remembers what he actually owes his family. She turned on a heel that clicked sharp against the stone floor and walked out, and the silence she left behind was worse than anything she'd said out loud. Giulia set the spoon down. You should have told me you were engaged before I spent all day at a fish market for you. I'm not engaged. Not really. It's paper my father signed before I was old enough to have a say in it, and I've spent 6 years finding reasons not to finish it. That's not a no, Dominic. That's a very expensive maybe. Something raw crossed his face, the first unguarded thing she'd seen from him since the hallway outside the private dining room. You want honesty? Fine. 2 years ago, I sat across from Vittoria's father and told him I wasn't going through with it. 3 days later, my sister's car went off the West Side Highway at 40 miles an hour on a dry night with no other vehicle involved. His jaw tightened, the ink at his throat moving with a muscle underneath it. She lived. Barely. Nobody's ever proven it was a message. Nobody's ever had to. I signed the paperwork again a week after she came out of the coma. The kitchen felt suddenly very small, the copper pots hanging overhead, the low hum of the ovens, none of it enough to fill the silence that followed. So you're telling me, Giulia said slowly, that the woman who just threatened me with a smile has a family capable of putting your sister in a coma to make a point. I'm telling you, that's the world you almost walked into last night without knowing it. And I should have told you before I sent a car for you this morning. And I didn't, because some part of me wanted one more day where you looked at me like I was just a man who liked your cooking. He said it fast, like it cost him something to get it out at all, like admitting weakness wasn't a language he'd practiced enough to speak smoothly. That's not fair to me. I know. You don't get to make decisions about what's dangerous for me, and just not tell me. I know that too. He crossed the kitchen, closing the distance she hadn't invited him to close, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to keep looking at him. I'm telling you now, all of it. Vittoria's family will find out your name by tomorrow, if they haven't already. They'll find out about your father. And in their world, a Moretti standing this close to a Marchetti isn't a coincidence. It's a story, and stories like that end up costing people things. Then maybe I should walk away from your kitchen and go back to being invisible. It kept me alive for 11 years. Is that what you want? The question hung there, and Giulia realized she didn't have a fast answer to it, that some part of her, the part that had stood frozen in a hallway 2 nights ago and then hadn't stayed frozen, didn't want to go back to invisible even a little bit, even knowing what standing in the light might cost. Before she could say any of that out loud, the kitchen door opened again. Not Vittoria this time, but Tomas, and the look on his face stopped every half-formed thought in the room cold. Dumb. 2 cars just pulled up outside the gate. Calabrese plates. Salvatore called it in. He says Vittoria's father isn't the first one, and he's not smiling. Dominic's whole body shifted, some switch flipping from the man who'd just confessed something raw to the man who'd walked out into a hallway and silenced a room with 3 words. How many men? 6 that we can see. Get Giulia out through the kitchen exit. No, the word came out of Giulia before she decided to say it, surprising her as much as it surprised him. I'm not hiding in a pantry while you handle this. I'm the reason they're here. I'll stand in the room. Dominic looked at her like she'd said something in a language he hadn't expected her to speak, something that sounded, for the first time all night, like an answer to the question he'd just asked her. Giulia, you said everyone in that room already thinks something's happening between us. Hiding me in a pantry just proves them right. Standing next to you proves them wrong. She untied her apron, hung it on the hook by the door with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, and smoothed down the front of her dress. I've spent my whole life letting rooms decide what I'm worth before I open my mouth. Not tonight. Dominic held her gaze for one long second, then nodded once, sharp, like a man recalculating a plan mid-motion and finding the new version acceptable. Stay behind me until I say otherwise. They walked out together, through the dining room where 18 guests had gone from murmuring appreciation over dessert to a tense, watchful silence. Out into the grand foyer where the front doors were already opening to let in a man Giulia had never seen, but recognized instantly by the way the air changed around him. Calabrese, Vittoria's father, silver-haired and immaculate, flanked by 6 men who filled the doorway like a wall. Dominic. The older man's voice was pleasant, almost warm, which somehow made it worse. My daughter called me in tears. Said you humiliated her in her own future home. This isn't her home, Salvatore. Not the same Salvatore from the dinner. Giulia realized, a different man entirely, the name apparently common currency in this world, and she wasn't humiliated. She was told the truth, which I understand isn't something she's used to hearing. Calabrese's eyes moved past Dominic to Giulia, and she felt the full weight of that inventory the way she had with Vittoria, except colder, more calculating, a man doing arithmetic instead of cruelty. Frank Moretti's girl. I heard the resemblance was strong. I didn't believe it until now. You knew my father. It wasn't a question anymore. Nobody in this world seemed to deal in coincidence. I knew what your father knew, Calabrese said, which is why I find it very interesting that his daughter is standing in this house, on this night, at the exact moment my daughter's engagement is being publicly discarded. His voice hadn't risen at all, but something underneath it had sharpened. Some men would call that a message, Dominic. A calculated one. There's no message. There's a woman I respect standing where she wants to stand. Dominic didn't move an inch, didn't so much as shift his weight, and Giulia understood suddenly that this stillness was its own kind of violence, a promise of what would happen if anyone in that doorway tested it. Say what you actually came here to say. Calabrese smiled, thin and humorless. The contracts, the shipping lanes we've shared for 11 years, since before you took over from your father. Those don't survive an insult like tonight's. You understand that. I understand you're threatening to burn 11 years of business over your daughter's pride. I'm protecting my daughter's future. Your daughter's future was never going to include me, Salvatore, whether Giulia existed or not. You knew that 2 years ago. You just like the leverage too much to let it go. Dominic's voice dropped lower, harder. So let's be honest with each other, the way men who've done business together for 11 years should be. You can walk away from the contracts. I'll survive it, badly, for a year, and then I'll build new lanes because that's what I do. Or you can walk out that door, go home, and let your daughter find a man who actually wants to marry her, instead of one who spent 6 years finding excuses not to. The foyer held its breath. One of Calabrese's men shifted his jacket, and Tomas, standing just off to the side, went very still in a way that made Giulia's pulse spike. Nobody needs to reach for anything tonight, Giulia said, and every head in that entryway turned toward her, startled that the woman at the center of this had a voice at all. My father used to say something before he died, that the men who last longest in this business are the ones who know the difference between a threat and a trade. You didn't come here for a fight, Mr. Calabrese. You came here to see if you still had leverage. You don't. So the real question is what you're going to do now that you know it. Calabrese studied her for a long, silent moment, something shifting behind his eyes that looked almost like respect, grudging and unwilling but real. Frank's girl, he said again, quieter this time, like he was filing something away. He'd have liked that answer. He turned to Dominic. The contracts stand through the end of the fiscal year. After that, we renegotiate like businessmen, not in-laws. My daughter will find someone who wants her. You're right about that much. He inclined his head, a formal, old-world gesture that seemed to close something between them, and walked back out into the night, his men falling in behind him like a tide pulling back from shore. The doors closed. The foyer exhaled all at once, 18 dinner guests suddenly remembering how to breathe, murmuring flooding back into the space the silence had left behind. Dominic turned to Giulia, and everything guarded in his face had finally, fully come undone. You didn't have to do that. I know. You could have stayed in the kitchen. I know that too. She looked up at him, at the ink disappearing under his collar, at the eyes that had gone from unreadable to completely open in the space of one dinner, and felt something settle in a place that had been unsteady her entire adult life. The sense of finally being exactly the size the room required, instead of asking permission to take up any space in it at all. I'm done being the woman kitchen's hide in the back. If you want me standing next to you, Dominic, it has to be like this. Out loud, in front of everyone. He reached up, tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that didn't match anything else about that night, about that house, about the 6 men who just walked away from his front door. Out loud, he repeated like he was making a vow instead of an agreement. In front of everyone. Starting now. He kissed her there in the foyer, in front of 18 guests and Tomas, and the closed door Calabrese had just walked through, and somewhere behind him someone started clapping, and then someone else, until the sound filled the whole entryway, the same rooms that had spent Giulia's whole life deciding she didn't belong in them, now loud with people who'd just watch her prove otherwise. If this story meant something to you, hit like, drop a comment telling us the moment that hit hardest, and subscribe for the next one. Because Giulia and Dominic's story is only just getting started, and you don't want to miss what comes next.